Well, you might not believe it, but there are 7 actors I really hate. They're not just fake, but always trying to hold others back.
There was once a Hollywood star who had shared a bed with him for 3 long years, only to suddenly walk away and marry a woman without so much as a word of warning. Steve McQueen only discovered the truth when he saw the wedding photo splashed across the cover of a magazine. Then there was another man who, consumed by jealousy, drove his car straight into McQueen's on the racetrack, nearly killing them both in a fiery collision. And there was even a certain name, one that, if it so much as appeared on the television screen, would make McQueen instantly switch it off and turn his face away, unable to endure the bitter sting of defeat. These were 7 individuals, 7 names that clung to McQueen like shadows, haunting him right up until the very end of his life. It was a blacklist never before revealed, one he guarded as carefully as a wound that never truly closed. And now, for the very first time, the full truth will finally be exposed. Who were they, and why was it that the mere mention of their names was enough to make McQueen grit his teeth and clench his fists so tightly that his knuckles split and bled? We begin with the very first, the former lover, the deepest scar etched into his heart, Paul Newman. Number 1, Paul Newman, the former lover and the shadow that haunted. Steve McQueen until his final breath. Hollywood in the 1960s sparkled like a dazzling galaxy. Yet behind the blinding lights lay a world where stars clawed and trampled over one another just to shine brighter than the rest. Among those countless names, Steve McQueen and Paul Newman formed a pair steeped in tension and drama. Not only relentless rivals, but also, according to confidential files leaked in 1981, secret lovers who shared an affair lasting nearly 3 years. It all began on the set of Somebody Up There Likes Me in 1956. At the time, McQueen was a complete unknown, fumbling through forgettable supporting roles. Paul Newman, already famous and influential in the industry, was the one who quietly introduced McQueen to director Robert Wise, giving him his first real chance in film. Their closeness developed with surprising speed, to the point of raising suspicions. The two would often drive off to Palm Springs for days at a time, disappearing together into a discreet rented house where not even their closest colleagues were allowed to visit. Years later, in an unaired CBS interview from 1992, former set assistant Lenny DuPont revealed a chilling detail. "I once saw Steve and Paul sitting close together inside a trailer, their eyes locked on each other. And it wasn't the way 2 friends looked at one another. There was something intimate there, something real, something forbidden." But the secret relationship ended with a cold and merciless twist. When Newman abruptly announced his engagement to Joanne Woodward and declared he was getting married, McQueen seemed crushed in front of the entire world. He bitterly confided to director Sam Peckinpah during a drunken night in Montana in 1960, "I never got a single explanation. I just woke up, opened Life magazine, and there he was, grinning on the cover, talking about a perfect wedding. I can't believe how foolish I was." From that moment, admiration turned to bitterness. Intimacy became obsession. McQueen launched into a silent war. No matter the cost, he had to surpass Paul Newman. Whenever Newman joined a project, McQueen looked for a counterweight. Newman drove race cars in winning, so McQueen countered with Le Mans. Newman played the classic hero, so McQueen deliberately chose the rebellious outlaw, as if to carve himself into Newman's opposite. The breaking point came in 1968, when 20th Century Fox invited the 2 stars to reunite in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. At first, both men were enthusiastic, but when the first promotional poster was printed, everything fell apart. On it, Newman's name appeared higher, in larger font, and to add insult, it even had one more letter than McQueen's. Furious, McQueen smashed an ashtray in the meeting room. "I said from the beginning, I will never be placed beneath him, not by an inch," he shouted at the producers. According to Secretary Janet Holloway, McQueen rejected every apology. He demanded that all posters, trailers, and press materials be redesigned to ensure absolute equality. When the studio refused, he walked away without hesitation, abandoning a role worth millions of dollars simply because his pride had been wounded. But the hostilities continued. In 1973, both actors starred in The Towering Inferno. After filming, McQueen became convinced that Newman had used his influence with the director to diminish his role. He claimed that in the original script he had several important lines, but in the final cut, those lines were either erased or reassigned to Newman. Outraged, McQueen took Warner Brothers to court, publicly accusing the studio of violating the script parody clause in his contract, and even naming Newman directly in the lawsuit. He hired Marvin Mitchelson, a high-profile lawyer who had represented Elvis Presley. Newman's camp retaliated by bringing in attorneys from Loeb & Loeb, one of Los Angeles' most powerful firms. A courthouse worker later told LA Weekly, "I'd never seen two movie stars drag each other into court over screen time and dialogue. They hauled in piles of backstage tapes, script notes, even hundreds of unused reels, arguing over every single frame." The trial dragged on for months. In the end, Warner Brothers paid $2 million to smother the scandal and keep it away from the press. But the damage was permanent. From that day forward, McQueen and Newman never faced each other again. They avoided one another at award ceremonies, tributes, and premieres. If circumstances forced them into the same place, McQueen would simply slip out of the spotlight or leave early without a word. Once, on The Tonight Show, when asked if it was true he disliked Paul Newman, McQueen only smiled, sipped his whiskey, and replied slowly, "If Hollywood were a church, Paul would definitely be the statue of a saint, but a hollow plaster one." In 1986, when Newman received an honorary Oscar, a reporter asked McQueen if he had any message for his former co-star. McQueen smirked and answered, "So now he's got his golden statue, right? I guess that makes him a real saint now." The words sounded light, but they cut deep with venom. After McQueen's death from cancer in 1980, his personal assistant discovered an old photograph of him and Newman while sorting through his belongings. The picture had been torn in half, leaving only McQueen's side intact. The half with Newman's face was missing. Whether burned or hidden away, no one knows. What unsettled people most, however, was the final diary entry McQueen had written in shaky handwriting just days before his passing. "I was once the man he loved, the only one who truly understood him, but then he chose to bury me beneath his own shadow, and that I have never forgiven." Only then did the world realize that Steve McQueen's deepest wound was not Paul Newman's fame, but the anguish of being trampled and abandoned in darkness by the very man he had once loved. Number 2. Clint Eastwood, the silent nightmare in Steve McQueen's dream of glory. Clint Eastwood was the name Steve McQueen almost never dared to mention directly, even though deep inside he carried a seething resentment so intense that every time he saw Eastwood's face on the cover of a magazine, he would lose sleep for nights on end. McQueen was the kind of man who could openly hurl insults, pick fights, or even play dirty tricks with just about anyone. But when it came to Clint, he chose silence, not out of respect, simply because he had no idea how to defeat someone who never fought back with words. The two never acted together in a film, never shook hands at an awards ceremony, and never once appeared in the same frame. Yet between them existed a quiet war, bloodless but never peaceful. McQueen was notorious for his pickiness with scripts. He once flatly rejected the role of the stoic gunslinger in A Fistful of Dollars, and dismissed the hot-headed cop in Dirty Harry as cheap and shallow. But only a few months later, Eastwood appeared on screen in those very roles, and they sparked a worldwide phenomenon. A face cold as steel, eyes narrowed and unblinking, a few terse lines of dialogue, and suddenly his presence echoed across all of Hollywood. Once, when McQueen was handed the script for Pale Rider, he barely skimmed a few pages before flinging the stack of papers at the wall, muttering through clenched teeth, "Not reading this. It reeks of Clint." McQueen often sneered that Eastwood was just a lanky guy who can't act. Yet, whenever Clint's films premiered, he would quietly slip into a theater, sit in the dark, and watch the whole thing. And afterward, he would storm home, slam his fist on the table, berate his assistant, and call his agent in a fury, demanding to know why all the best roles kept slipping away into Clint's hands. That anger was never spoken aloud, but it smoldered inside him like a malignant growth. It festered so deeply that during a press conference in 1975, when asked about the rising generation of masculine actors, McQueen only named a few forgettable names before quickly changing the subject. But when pressed with the question, "And what about Clint Eastwood?" McQueen curled his lip into a sneer and snapped coldly, "That guy? Well, good luck to him in the future. But I don't care to watch cowboy movies where the man doesn't even know how to hold a gun properly. Nothing but a sham." Clint, on the other hand, rarely fired back directly. But in an interview with Variety, when asked about roles that had been rejected by others before landing in his hands, Eastwood smirked and replied, "Well, some people won't put on a cowboy hat, won't chew a cigar, won't ride a horse through the mud. Me? I don't mind getting dirty. And just wait and see who ends up the winner in the end." As rumors swirled that McQueen despised Eastwood because he believed Clint was nothing more than a product manufactured by media hype and massive promotional campaigns from his own production company. That only made McQueen more bitter, because no matter how hard he tried, his films could never beat Clint's at the box office. Distributors consistently favored Eastwood's movies because they were considered safe, reliable, and easy to sell, while McQueen's projects were often labeled unpredictable and too artsy. For years, whispers circulated that McQueen had even hired paparazzi to trail Clint, hoping to dig up dirt, secret homosexual affairs, lavish parties laced with drugs, but nothing ever surfaced, or if it did, it was swiftly buried. Some even claimed Clint had lawyers threaten the press with lawsuits if they dared to publish any leaks supplied by McQueen's people. There was never an open war, but both sides allegedly planted spies in each other's circles, like two aging spies locked in a lifelong grudge. One memorable moment came in 1978, when McQueen appeared on a television talk show. The host suddenly shifted the topic to, "Who is the true man of modern America?" Just as the MC was about to say Clint's name, McQueen cut him off sharply, his voice cold and clipped. Don't use that name while I'm sitting here." The cruelest twist came in McQueen's final years, as cancer ravaged his body. He instructed his family never to turn on the TV if a Clint Eastwood film was playing. "I don't ever want to see that guy winning again," he whispered, eyes shut tight. An old friend once remarked, "If there was anyone who could drive Steve mad without saying a word, it was Clint." Every move he made was like a slap straight across Steve's pride. And so, among all the public enemies and noisy rivalries Steve McQueen endured, Clint Eastwood remained the only name that haunted him for life, a silent nightmare that shadowed him all the way to his dying breath. Number 3. Charles Bronson. His very existence was a challenge that kept McQueen awake at night. The third name on the list of people Steve McQueen hated the most was none other than Charles Bronson. In Hollywood, there are those who scramble loudly for the spotlight, and there are those who simply stand in silence, without speaking, without smiling, yet still manage to make the entire room fall quiet. Charles Bronson belonged to the latter. Born into a harshly poor family in Pennsylvania and forced to work in coal mines from the age of 10, he entered the world of cinema carrying eyes that reflected not the sparkle of stardom, but steel and ashes. And it was precisely this that always kept Steve McQueen on edge, until it cost him more than he ever realized. Their first appearance together was in The Great Escape. McQueen was given the glory of spectacular action scenes, from the iconic motorcycle leap over the prison fence to the dramatic close-ups that made him the undeniable star. Bronson stepped back, seemingly yielding all the limelight to McQueen. Yet what McQueen did not see was the quiet gaze and the calm nod Bronson gave behind the camera each time the director called cut, a presence that lingered long after. A few years later, when the script for Death Wish was being shopped around, a cold-blooded story of personal justice, McQueen scoffed at first, dismissing it as too violent, cheap, and shallow. But the moment he heard that Bronson was in talks, he immediately reversed course, phoning his agent to demand script revisions that would make it deeper, more meaningful, more idealistic, all in a bid to snatch the role. In the end, however, the studio chose Bronson, and when Death Wish finally premiered, Hollywood was stunned. The film exceeded every expectation, sparking a cultural frenzy over vigilante justice, while Bronson, stone-faced and expressionless, emerged as the ruthless avenger and cold-blooded icon of American cinema. McQueen said nothing, but that silence was not born of respect. It was the bitterness of defeat. By 1978, a shocking scandal erupted behind the scenes. At a private Beverly Hills party, rumors spread that Bronson had brought along a young male model, accompanied by other familiar names in the world of action stars. A week later, an anonymous article surfaced accusing Steve McQueen of indulging in drugs and ambiguous relationships with both men and women during after-parties for Bullitt. Bronson's name never appeared in the piece, yet within Hollywood circles, whispers grew louder. Two men who had once been comrades were now exposing each other's darkest secrets through the dirtiest means imaginable. Hounded by the press, McQueen shot back during an interview, "I don't need to play a murderer to prove my toughness. The men who take those roles are just hiding behind a fake shell." The remark seemed harmless on the surface, but everyone knew he was aiming directly at Bronson's most iconic role. Not long after, an A-list director revealed that McQueen had turned down a project simply because Bronson had been invited to audition first. The silent war only escalated, carrying over to the set of The Mechanic, a film McQueen had once negotiated for, only to see the role stolen by Bronson. And once again, the film became a resounding success. They didn't need to face each other to fight. They didn't need to argue to know they had been aiming their guns at one another for decades, through rumors, through the press, and through a silence as cold as the sound of a cocked weapon, as McQueen lay on his deathbed, ravaged by cancer. A close friend recalled how he often avoided watching television whenever Death Wish or any Bronson film was playing, not out of hatred, but because he simply couldn't endure the taste of defeat. Bronson, true to his taciturn nature, never once spoke publicly about McQueen. Only once, when asked about his relationship with the late King of Cool, did he smirk and respond tersely, "I never competed for anything, but if I want something, I'll take it, no matter what." Yar 4. Faye Dunaway, the sexiest kiss of the 1960s and the garlic stench of hatred. In a decade when cinema overflowed with fiery kisses and smoldering glances, the Thomas Crown Affair, 1968, shook all of Hollywood with a kiss that lasted nearly 90 seconds, uncut, without music, without dialogue. There was only the sound of breathing, the suffocating silence, and what audiences believed to be an irresistible passion exploding between two stars. But they were wrong. Behind the kiss, hailed as the most beautiful of the decade, was in fact a brutal hidden war so intense that no one involved could ever forget. It was not love, but humiliation, the raw stench of garlic, jealousy, and betrayal colder than the camera lens itself. From the very first script reading, there wasn't a trace of courtesy between Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway. Faye walked into the meeting clutching a notebook packed with annotations on character psychology, layered emotions, and nuanced traits. Steve glanced over, smirked, and tossed his script down onto the table as if it were nothing more than a gas receipt. The air turned so tense that director Norman Jewison cut the meeting short after only 15 minutes, fearing someone might literally throw a chair. Not long after, Faye heard a rumor that McQueen had mocked her during a drinking session with the crew, calling her a stage woman deluding herself into thinking she's the next Meryl Streep. She did not stay quiet. At the film's very first press conference, Faye openly sneered that her co-star doesn't understand a thing about the character. He only flexes his biceps and hopes the director wraps the scene fast enough so he can drive back to Malibu. The Hollywood Reporter printed her words verbatim on a prime page, and from that moment on, McQueen decided it was time for payback. The silent war began. The flames roared to life when Faye discovered that her boyfriend at the time, Italian actor Carlo Ferranti, had been invited by McQueen to a private party at his rented beachside retreat for the crew. Faye herself had not been invited. Carlo did not return until the following morning. No one said what had happened, but soon after, a leaked photograph from a film developer's lab surfaced, showing McQueen and Carlo sitting together on the hood of a Porsche, laughing as if the world belonged only to them. Faye needed no explanation. She went silent for 3 days, then returned to set with an expression so cold no one dared approach her. From then on, her gaze toward McQueen had transformed. No longer simple dislike, but absolute contempt. When the day came to film the kiss, everyone on set sensed a storm about to break. McQueen arrived early, and according to the catering staff, he had eaten 2 raw cloves of garlic with a cup of strong coffee. As Faye entered the dressing room, her assistant nearly choked back a laugh while whispering, "Steve hasn't brushed his teeth this morning." She froze for a moment, then answered flatly, "Good, leave it that way." The camera rolled, no dialogue, no elaborate direction, just 2 people stepping toward each other, lips meeting lips, but with each passing second, it was unclear whether they were kissing or waging war through every sense at their disposal. Faye clenched Steve's collar so tightly that the microphone picked up the sound of fabric scraping. McQueen ground his teeth. Faye drove her knee into his thigh as though trying to dislocate it. The director dared not call cut because the camera was capturing something rare, not passion, but hatred transmuted into what would later be called cinematic chemistry. When the scene ended, McQueen turned and stormed out without a word. Faye straightened her blouse and, glancing at the trembling makeup artist in the corner, said coolly, "I just kissed a venomous snake. And from this moment on, I'll never step foot in this nest again." But McQueen wasn't done. During the editing process, he secretly asked the director to cut nearly all of Faye's most striking close-ups from the key dialogue scenes. The justification, recorded in MGM's internal emails, was, "She steals the light, throwing the frame off balance." In truth, McQueen could not bear the thought that audiences might remember Faye's eyes more vividly than his own lines. He struck her down with the very weapon she wielded best, the camera. Faye refused to retaliate. She filed no lawsuits, offered no comments to the press. But in 1978, during an interview in Paris, when asked about McQueen, she simply sighed and looked directly into the lens. "We once created a kiss considered iconic, but it wasn't passion. It was 2 beasts trying to sever each other's emotional nerves." The response was brief. but it sent chills through both the audience and the journalists present. For within her words, there was no hatred spoken, only the echo of pain vibrating through silence. As for McQueen, friends recalled a night of drinking on Catalina when that very kiss replayed on television. He sat motionless for a long moment, then muttered through his intoxication, "I've never felt so weak, and I did everything in my power to make sure no one ever saw me that way again." Many believed that after Faye Dunaway, McQueen had learned a bitter lesson, never again to let emotions infiltrate his work. But the truth was the opposite. Just 1 year later, he would place his complete trust in another man, and that man, behind his back, would crush him without mercy when the opportunity came. That man was Yul Brynner. Revive, Yul Brynner, the king whose crown was stolen on set. Brynner, with his regal image and that commanding bald head, had once won an Oscar for his portrayal of King Mongkut in The King and I. He would walk onto a film set as though he were the one truly in control of everything. From costumes, lighting, even down to the height of the platform he stood on, he demanded adjustments to ensure he stood out above all. His contract even carried a special clause. No actor shall be allowed to stand taller than me in the same scene. But then came the storm known as Steve McQueen. Without declarations, without arrogance, he simply and quietly overshadowed the king who thought he sat securely on his throne. McQueen wasn't after the lead role, but whenever he appeared on camera, he had a bag of tricks that made it impossible for audiences to look away, spinning his gun repeatedly, flipping his hat, tapping his boots to a rhythm, lifting a glass of water to sniff before setting it back down with intent, or even letting out a perfectly timed soft yawn just as Brynner was delivering a line. These seemingly harmless little maneuvers left Brynner bitterly faded in comparison. Director John Sturges would later recall in his memoir, "Steve had this bizarre talent. He knew exactly when the camera was zooming in on someone else, and that was when he would do something more captivating. No one taught him that. He was simply a creature born to devour the frame." Brynner, of course, didn't see it that way. He flew into rages. Time and again, he demanded that the director cut out McQueen's distracting actions, even going so far as to call for the firing of the lighting assistant because he felt he wasn't lit prominently enough. On one occasion, he shouted directly into McQueen's face on set, "Who do you think you are? Some two-bit cowboy who dares steal the spotlight from me?" McQueen only smirked, speaking not loudly but firmly enough for the entire crew to hear. "I'm not stealing the spotlight, Mr. Yul. It just happens to find me on its own." That retort landed like a slap across Brynner's pride, and when the film premiered, the truth struck mercilessly. America went wild for McQueen, a man with barely a few dozen lines, yet radiating a cold, magnetic charisma no one else could match. Meanwhile, Brynner, carrying the lead role, was derided as too stiff, too theatrical, too stage-bound. The most brutal blow came in 1961 when the New York Times published its review, closing with the line, "The Magnificent Seven has a leader, but it is not the man written into the script." A single sentence nearly shattered Brynner's spirit. The feud did not fade. By 1966, with McQueen cemented as Hollywood's #1 star in The Sandpebbles, Brynner lashed out in an interview with the Sunday Times London, branding McQueen as a trickster who deceives audiences with cheap gimmicks, and adding with a jab, "Some men are born for art, and some are born only to distract from their lack of talent." McQueen didn't hold back. At a Beverly Hills press conference, when asked about Brynner's insult, he laughed and coolly replied, "I'm not surprised. He spent his whole life wearing a crown. But I know this much. Audiences aren't interested in kings anymore. They want real people, real scars, and that's what I give them." The conflict reached its peak in 1969, when United Artists re-released The Magnificent Seven with a brand new poster. At its center was McQueen on horseback, the light shining directly on his face, while Brynner had been cut out entirely. It was more than just a poster, it was a silent declaration. The once crowned king had been dethroned. Brynner was enraged. He filed a lawsuit against the studio for violating promotional agreements and, according to records at the American Film Archive, demanded $500,000 in damages for his wounded honor. The case was ultimately dismissed, but the whispers lingered. Now all he has left is a crown to display in his trophy room. Years later, after being diagnosed with lung cancer, Brynner was asked in an NBC interview whether he ever wished to reconcile with McQueen, staring directly into the camera. Without a smile, without a shrug, he said only one sentence. He is living proof that fame does not necessarily equal respect. In 1977, that secret entered a new chapter when Liberace hired Scott Thorson, an 18-year-old boy, to be his assistant and companion. For 5 years, the two were entwined in a relationship everyone understood but no one dared to name. Later, in his memoir, Thorson wrote, "He gave me cars, he gave me jewelry, but what Liberace truly wanted in return was complete devotion." That love-hate story was later brought to the screen in Behind the Candelabra. The lawsuit was ultimately settled out of court in 1986, but its echoes remained like a... Don't hesitate to share this video with the friends you truly cherish, as a reminder that love and authenticity are always worth treasuring, even when the journey sometimes has to pass through loss and pain. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next moving stories. Leave your comments below to share your thoughts with us, because every single opinion is invaluable in helping us improve and grow. An anonymous source, who had once been a wardrobe assistant on The Great Escape, revealed in internal CBS documents in 1993. Both of them were trying to get close to Anthony. One gave him a Vespa, the other took him out to dinner every night. And when Anthony chose to spend a weekend getaway in Palm Springs with McQueen, everything between them shattered. Garner felt betrayed, not only because he lost the man he had been pursuing, but because the winner turned out to be his closest friend. From that moment, the atmosphere on set shifted dramatically. McQueen carried himself with a sense of triumph, while Garner grew increasingly cold and unpredictable. What followed was a string of silent counterattacks, cruel and destructive, sweeping through Hollywood's backstage like a quiet storm. Garner, with his calm and calculating demeanor, began dropping hints to the press that McQueen was a man with odd behavior toward male co-stars. He suggested there had been unnecessary intimacy between McQueen and Anthony during private rehearsals. Soon after, the Saturday Evening Post published a 1964 article with the headline, "Hollywood's Lone Man, What is Steve McQueen Hiding?" McQueen, of course, did not remain quiet. He retaliated by spreading word that Garner was a hypocrite, who had once propositioned Anthony in the dressing room and lashed out in jealousy after being rejected. Crew members later recounted how McQueen once slipped a note into Garner's jacket pocket, scrawled with the cutting words, "If you can't have him, then at least don't destroy everything. The stench of failure can't be covered up with cologne." The feud escalated to such an extent that director John Sturges was forced to film their scenes separately, splicing shots together so they wouldn't have to look each other in the eye. But the nightmare was far from over. In 1965, at the Riverside International Raceway, both McQueen and Garner registered to compete in a charity race. On paper, it was an event to raise funds, but in reality, it was Garner's chance to teach McQueen a lesson. By the 9th lap, McQueen's car was suddenly forced hard into a corner by a blazing red Shelby Cobra, driven by none other than Garner himself. The impact sent McQueen spinning out of control, skidding off the track and crashing into the guardrail. Luckily, no one was seriously injured, but the incident left Hollywood stunned into silence. McQueen never called the police, but a week later, he filed a lawsuit against Garner, accusing him of endangering life in a sporting environment. Garner fired back with a countersuit, charging McQueen with defamation and deliberate character sabotage. Both men hired high-profile legal teams, and the case dragged on for more than 8 months, consuming nearly $600,000 in legal fees, only to finally end in a quiet settlement. When asked why he didn't pursue the lawsuit to the end, Garner offered only a bitter reply. "I once thought we were friends, but clearly, there are things he's willing to take, at any cost." And McQueen, in a 1973 interview with Esquire, he sneered at the mention of Garner. "Garner is the kind of man who fights below the belt, but with me, if he throws one punch, I'll make sure he never gets back up for another." And so, a friendship once celebrated across Hollywood died in betrayal, jealousy, and underhanded blows, where both men sought victory, but neither remained clean enough to still be called a hero. Number 7. Robert Vaughn, the one once considered a younger brother, yet ultimately the deadliest stab in the back. The final name on this list is Robert Vaughn. They had once stood side by side in The Magnificent Seven, 1960, sharing not only the same frames on screen, but also laughter behind the scenes, even uniting on the same front when fighting the studio for fair treatment of their fellow actors. McQueen had once proudly told his assistant That kid Vaughn's got brains, not like those loud-mouthed, empty-headed stars out there. But that was before Hollywood's dazzling spotlight distorted everything. In 1968, when McQueen began preparing Bullitt, the project he considered the defining work of his career, he personally recommended Vaughn for the role of politician Chalmers. At the time, everyone assumed this was proof of an unshakable friendship within a cutthroat industry. Yet, the very moment Vaughn began receiving glowing praise from the press, with headlines like "The Serious Soul Behind the Charming Smile" in Variety, a hidden flame of resentment began burning inside McQueen. He grew bitterly unsettled hearing people commend Vaughn for having greater acting depth. He seethed when director Peter Yates confided quietly, "Vaughn brings an intellectual danger to the role. Steve is still just the handsome action guy." Soon afterward, the script was quietly altered. Vaughn's character, originally written as morally ambiguous, layered, both trustworthy and menacing, was gradually rewritten into a cowardly, greedy, and thoroughly unlikable politician. Vaughn never realized what was happening. All he knew was that with each passing day on set, his role seemed to be shrinking and losing dimension. Behind the scenes, McQueen began spreading contempt. To different members of the crew, he would scoff, "Vaughn, oh right, that dull little TV spy guy. What was that show again? Man from NCLE? Sorry, I don't waste my time watching garbage like that." The tension reached its breaking point at a lavish party hosted by director John Frankenheimer in the Hollywood Hills, spring of 1969. It was a grand evening, filled with powerful producers, directors, and top actors. Vaughn, dressed sharply in a tuxedo, had been seated right next to McQueen. Yet only minutes later, McQueen turned to his assistant with an icy glare and said loud enough for others to hear, "I won't sit and eat with someone who uses the name of friendship just to climb on my back. Get me another table." He stood up and walked out, leaving the entire room in stunned silence. Vaughn tried to keep his composure, but his hand tightened around his glass so hard his knuckles went white. Witnesses later recalled that after the party, Vaughn drove home alone, without uttering a single word, years later. In an interview with the Los Angeles Times, Vaughn finally admitted with bitterness, "That look of contempt in his eyes is something I will never forget. But what could I do? Maybe he hated me simply because I was more successful. Thanks a lot, Steve." The man who had once been a comrade, someone McQueen trusted, turned out to be the one who mercilessly dragged him down the moment the opportunity presented itself. And in the glittering yet treacherous world of Hollywood, sometimes you don't even need enemies. Just one old friend who becomes jealous at the right time is enough to stab you in the back. And yet, if Robert Vaughn was the fatal dagger lodged in his back, the next figure was far worse, an unspoken nightmare that haunted Steve McQueen for countless sleepless nights. A man who didn't need to utter a single word, but whose very presence, just one look, one turn of the body, was enough to make an entire film crew hold its breath. Number 8. Marlon Brando, the silent nightmare and the shadow that could never be erased. If Robert Vaughn was the knife in the back, then Marlon Brando was like a towering mountain standing right in front of him, a colossal shadow that Steve McQueen could never escape for as long as he lived. McQueen could test his speed against Paul Newman, play sly tricks to undercut Yul Brynner, or lock himself in bitter rivalry with Charles Bronson. But when it came to Brando, he never dared to challenge him openly, not because of respect, but because of the fear of being swallowed whole. Brando never needed to fight for the spotlight. The moment he stepped onto a set, the entire room would fall silent. He didn't need long lines of dialogue, just one vague look, a faint curl of the lip, and the camera seemed to tremble as though it had belonged to him all along. McQueen, the man who once believed himself to be the coolest king of Hollywood, suddenly looked small whenever Brando appeared on screen. People said that McQueen often locked himself away to secretly rewatch a streetcar named Desire or On the Waterfront in his private screening room. He would sit alone, fingers tapping restlessly, eyes glued to Brando, torn between envy and the desperate urge to learn. But each time it ended the same way, McQueen would explode in rage, smash his whiskey glass, and shout at his assistant, "Why can't I do that? Why?" In 1966, when MGM was preparing to produce The Sand Pebbles, rumors spread that the role of Jake Holman had first been intended for Brando. When Brando declined, the part eventually landed in McQueen's hands. The film went on to be a success, yet McQueen carried a bitter taste. He had only been the second choice, a stand-in cast in the lingering shadow Brando had left behind. What cut deeper was Brando's dismissive attitude at the glittering parties of Beverly Hills. He rarely mentioned McQueen's name, and when pressed by reporters about the rising generation of actors, he said bluntly, "There are some guys who only know how to wear leather jackets, throw on sunglasses, and ride motorcycles. But when it comes to acting, they're empty." He never said the name, but everyone knew exactly whose chest he had just driven the knife into. McQueen never dared to retaliate in public. One drunken night with director Sam Peckinpah, he could only mutter bitterly, "I can beat Newman, Bronson, even Ewell, but Brando? No, that guy's not human. He's a ghost." And indeed, that ghost haunted him until the very end, even in his final days, lying on his deathbed. An old friend recalled how McQueen demanded the television be switched off if a Brando film came on. Closing his eyes tight, he whispered faintly, "Don't let me see him again. I've lost too many times already." Those are the 7 names that carved themselves into Steve McQueen's life like scars that would never fade, a burden he carried with him until his very last days, yet one he never once admitted aloud. Behind the blinding glamour of a movie star, McQueen was forced to live with the constant torment of wounded pride, the ache of unhealed pain, and a burning resentment that never ceased to consume him. They were not merely professional rivals on the path of his career. They were the very people who left behind the deepest, harshest cuts on the journey of a man who became a legend of cinema. And what about you? Among those 7 names, who do you believe inflicted the greatest suffering upon McQueen? Who, in your eyes, was the towering ghost that clung to him so relentlessly, a shadow he could never escape, not even as he drew his final breath? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear your opinion. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the untold stories about the dark, hidden, and yet irresistibly captivating side of Hollywood. We'll see you again in the next videos, where we will continue to uncover the shocking truths that lurk behind the dazzling glow of the spotlight.